We're counting down the 15 British foods your nan used to make. Dishes that fueled families through rationing, cold winters and hard times, but today are nearly vanished from British tables. From humble stews that turned cheap cuts into comfort, to puddings that stretched a few shillings into a sweet memory, each entry tells the story of survival, thrift, and the creativity born in post-war Britain. Expect calorie-laden classics, surprising ingredients, and flavors forged in times when nothing could be wasted. Which forgotten favorite tops the list? Let's begin our countdown with number 15. Number 15, beef stew with root vegetables anchored the winter table in post-war Britain. Its aroma, thick with the promise of warmth, drifted through cold terraces where coal fires struggled against damp stone. Housewives turned to shin or scrag end of beef, cuts costing less than 2 shillings a pound in the early 1950s, knowing that hours on the range would coax tenderness from the toughest meat. Carrot, swede, and onions filled the pot, but it was potatoes, 6 to 8 pounds per person each week, according to the National Food Survey, that gave the stew its body and kept hunger at bay. The kitchen windows fogged with condensation, a silent signal that supper was nearly ready. Children fished for the softest potato, saturated with meat juices, while fathers arrived from shipyards or mills, hands still cold, grateful for a ladleful of steaming broth. In some homes, the debate raged over watery school stew versus the proper thick version made at home. Yet for families living through rationing and long winters, this was more than a meal. It was comfort, ritual, and the taste of endurance. The stew pot became a gathering point, a simple answer to the question of how to stretch a shilling and fill every seat at the table. Number 14, dumplings and suet puddings brought heft to the British table when meat was scarce and hunger lingered at the door. Housewives reached for flour and suet, costing only pennies a pound in the early 1950s, rolling the mixture into pale, heavy balls or shaping it into dense puddings. By 1953, the National Food Survey recorded that each household went through nearly half a pound of suet every week, a testament to its role as the calorie workhorse of the post-war kitchen. Dropped into bubbling stews or set above simmering water, dumplings swelled as they cooked, absorbing the savory broth and sending the pot lid into a gentle, rhythmic rattle. That sound signaled both patience and promise. Tea time was close, and empty stomachs would soon be silenced. In cookery classes and Ministry of Food pamphlets, mothers learned to stretch a scant stew into a filling meal with just a handful of suet and flour, a trick passed down through generations. The steaming bowls that landed on the table were dense enough to fortify workers for long shifts, yet soft enough to comfort children bracing against the cold. Some later questioned the health of such heavy fare, but for a generation shaped by rationing, dumplings and suet puddings meant no one left the table hungry. They were more than an addition. They were the difference between making do and making a meal. Number 13. Lamb hot pot stood as the signature dish of northern mill towns, a meal that carried the pride of place as much as the weight of hunger. Housewives layered thin slices of potato and onion with chunks of mutton, the cheaper, fattier cousin of lamb, bought for just 1 shilling and 8 pence a pound in 1952. Each layer was arranged with care, knowing that hours in the oven would transform tough meat and ordinary vegetables into something deeply satisfying. The topmost potatoes crisped and browned, forming a crust that was fought over at the table, while the juices below soaked every layer in savory richness. In Lancashire, it was said you could smell a good hot pot 3 doors down, the aroma drifting through back alleys as families returned from the mills, tired and ravenous. Oral histories recall that no 2 households made it quite the same. Every mother claimed her method was best, and every child had a favorite corner. For many, hot pot was more than a way to stretch a scant meat ration. It was a badge of identity, a dish that marked out the North from the rest. When prosperity brought new foods and tastes, the hot pot faded from daily life. But its memory lingers as proof that hardship could still produce something worth gathering around. Number 12. Bubble and Squeak turned Monday's leftovers into a meal that was equal parts thrift and tradition. The name itself came from the sound, the vegetables hissing and protesting as they hit the hot pan, a reminder that nothing went to waste in a post-war kitchen. Housewives gathered up cold potatoes and wilted cabbage from Sunday's roast, sometimes with a stray carrot or parsnip, and mashed them together before frying until the edges crisped and browned. The smell of boiled cabbage divided families. Children wrinkled noses, mothers insisted it meant a clean plate, and fathers often claimed the browned bits were the best. Diaries from the early 1950s record the ritual. Monday, bubble and squeak again. Bill moaned, but not a scrap left. Ministry of Food campaigns praised the dish as a model of economy, but for most, it was simply the way things were done. A second life for vegetables that had already done their duty. In some homes, a spoonful of bacon fat or a pinch of leftover meat added luxury, but the heart of Bubble and Squeak remained humble. It was a dish born of discipline, a weekly answer to the challenge of feeding many on little. Today it survives mostly as a side, but once it was the main event, a symbol of ingenuity and the quiet pride of making something out of nothing. Number 11, Toad in the Hole, stood out as the playful answer to post-war thrift, a dish that turned a handful of sausages into a meal for the whole family. Sausages, already a staple at £1.50 per person each week by 1962, became the star not by their abundance, but by the magic of Yorkshire pudding batter. Housewives poured a simple mix of flour, eggs, and milk around the sausages, watching the batter rise and crisp at the edges while the middle stayed soft and comforting. The sizzle of fat in a battered tin was a familiar kitchen soundtrack, promising a golden crust that children eyed long before the pan left the oven. Fights broke out over the corners, the prized pieces where batter met tin and turned almost biscuit hard, while the youngest often received the soft, sausage-soaked center. Batter economics meant even a few sausages could stretch to feed 6, with flour and eggs filling bellies when meat was dear. Oral histories recall the laughter and squabbles at the table, the ritual of pouring onion gravy, and the way a humble oven bake became a highlight of the week. For many, it wasn't just dinner. It was a moment of lightness, a dish that made scarcity taste like celebration. Today, Toad in the Hole has faded from everyday kitchens, but the memory of those corner battles and the scent of sizzling batter lingers on, a reminder of how families made fun out of frugality. Number 10. Corned beef hash stood as the emblem of Britain's reliance on the global pantry when fresh meat was scarce and fridges were a distant dream. Housewives pried open blue-labeled tins shipped from Argentina, part of the vast trade that saw up to 200,000 tons of tinned beef arrive on British docks each year in the early 1950s, filling the gap left by rationed homegrown meat. The sharp metallic tang of corned beef was unmistakable, its dense pink slabs diced with potatoes and onions before hitting the pan. The sizzle as it fried promised something filling, if not exactly loved. In a time when less than half of homes had reliable refrigeration, tinned meat was insurance, waiting quietly in the cupboard through strikes, shortages, and the long winter months. Advertisements called it modern, but most families saw it as a fallback, not a treat. Children wrinkled their noses at the smell, mothers stretched a single tin to feed 5, and fathers accepted hash as the price of security. Ministry of Food cookery leaflets offered recipes for hash, fritters, and even pies, all designed to make the most of every ounce. Yet for many, the memory of corned beef hash is edged with both gratitude and resignation. A dish that sustained a nation, then vanished almost overnight as fresh meat and freezers became the new normal. Its absence now marks the distance between the Britain of thrift and the Britain of plenty. Number 9. Pea soup and ham bone stood as the quiet backbone of mining communities, especially through the long winters of the northeast. Housewives measured out dried split peas, 12 ounces a week, enough to fill a family pot, stretching them with water, onions, and whatever scraps the butcher's block could spare. A single ham bone, sometimes little more than gristle and memory, lent its smoky flavor to batch after batch. The pot was rarely emptied, but simply topped up and set back by the fireside. Oral histories from Durham pit villages recall the soup's thickness. So dense a spoon would stand upright, so green it seemed to glow against the grey of the kitchen. Children dipped hunks of bread, mothers worried over the next week's ration, and fathers swore it was the best fuel for a shift underground. In an era when meat was a luxury, dried peas became the working man's protein, recommended by the Ministry of Food and embraced out of necessity. The smell of simmering pulses seeped into stone walls, marking time between paydays. Still, for those who grew up with it, pea soup meant warmth and survival, a dish born of hardship, now all but vanished from modern tables, its memory thick as the broth it once filled. Number 8. Bread and dripping stands as the starkest reminder of post-war austerity, a meal built from necessity, not desire. In kitchens where the Sunday roast was a rare luxury, every drop of rendered fat was saved, cooled, and spooned onto thick slices of bread. By the early 1950s, a 2-pound loaf cost just 11 pence, with the National Food Survey recording average consumption at 4 loaves per person each week. Bread filled bellies when little else could, its soft crumb soaking up the salty, congealed dripping that carried the faint memory of meat long after the joint was gone. For many, this was supper: bread, a scrape of fat, and perhaps a pinch of salt. Diaries from the era speak plainly. That was dinner. You could taste last Sunday's roast, even if it was only bread and salt. In mining towns and city terraces alike, bread and dripping was the taste of making do. A meal that silenced hunger, but never pretended to comfort. Mothers rationed the precious fat, stretching it across the week, while children learned early that thrift was not a choice, but a condition. Today, the dish has vanished from most tables, its memory preserved in stories of hardship and resilience. Bread and dripping was more than a meal. It was survival, plain and unadorned, marking the sharp edge of post-war Britain's struggle to fill every plate. Number 7. Rabbit stew was the affordable answer to Britain's meat shortages, a dish that crossed from rural fields to city terraces, filling pots when wages and rations ran thin. In the early 1950s, market stalls sold rabbits for under a shilling each, making them the cheapest fresh protein for families with many mouths to feed. Housewives learned to stretch one rabbit with onions, carrots, and whatever root vegetables were left in the larder, simmering the lot until the meat slipped from the bone and the broth turned rich and fragrant. Recipes passed quietly between neighbors, each promising to feed 6 or even 8 on a single animal, with bread on the side to soak up every drop. Children eyed the legs first, mothers saved the back for the youngest, and fathers often took whatever was left, grateful for a meal that felt like a small victory over scarcity. Oral histories recall the pride in making a rabbit stew last 2 days, and the disappointment when none could be found at the market. As prosperity returned and chicken prices fell, rabbit stew faded quickly from the weekly menu, its memory now tied to stories of thrift and resilience. What once was a symbol of making do, poor man's chicken, has become a rarity, remembered more for the hardship it soothed than the taste it left behind. Number 6. Tripe and onions brought the sharpest divide to the British table, a dish that tested both palate and pride, especially in the industrial north. Housewives queued outside Manchester tripe shops, choosing pale, honeycombed slabs of cow stomach destined for long boiling with onions. In 1952, tripe accounted for 15% of all meat eaten in mill towns, a figure that speaks to both thrift and necessity. The smell, strong and persistent, seeped through terrace walls and lingered in kitchens long after plates were cleared. Children wrinkled noses, mothers persevered for the price, and fathers swore by its strength, each roll fixed by habit more than affection. Oral histories recall the ritual. Tripe, boiled until tender, served steaming with a pool of onion liquor and a shake of salt. For some, it was a badge of local resilience. For others, a weekly ordeal. Council records chart the rise and fall of tripe shops, over 300 in Greater Manchester during the 1950s, dwindling to a handful by the 1980s as supermarkets and changing tastes swept through the north. Shopkeepers remember the stigma. Tripe meant poor, meant old ways, meant the past. Still, for those who grew up with it, the memory is vivid. A food that separated generations, yet stitched together a story of survival. Loved or loathed, tripe and onions marked the edge of British thrift, its disappearance a sign that one kind of hunger had finally faded. Number 5. Rice pudding brought a rare moment of sweetness to kitchens shaped by thrift and endurance. Baked in battered enamel dishes, the scent of milk and vanilla drifted through the house, promising comfort after days of plain fare. By 1955, National Food Survey figures showed that 7 in 10 families made rice pudding at least once a week, a testament to its standing as the dessert of ordinary Britain. Housewives measured out short-grain rice, stirred in sugar and a splash of evaporated milk if they could spare it, then waited as the oven transformed the mixture into something golden and soothing. The skin, gleaming, caramelized, sometimes thick enough to lift in one piece, divided households as sharply as any main course. Children argued over who got the prized top layer, while others scraped it aside in search of the creamy heart beneath. Diaries from the era recall the simple pleasure of breaking through that skin, the spoon sinking into soft, sweetened rice, warm enough to cut through the chill of a coal-fired evening. School dinner menus featured rice pudding as a weekly staple, sometimes with a dab of jam or a dusting of nutmeg, but always as a promise that life could be a little less grim, even for just one spoonful. In a world where nothing was wasted, rice pudding stood as proof that comfort could be conjured from the simplest ingredients, a dish that lingered in memory long after the enamel dish was scraped clean. Number 4. Bread and butter pudding was the dessert that turned stale bread into a kitchen triumph. Housewives saved the ends and crusts, layering them in battered enamel dishes with handfuls of currants, pouring over a mixture of eggs, milk, and sugar. Ingredients measured with care when nothing could be wasted. In cookery classes run by the Women's Institute, the pudding was held up as the model of economy, a recipe that made virtue out of scarcity. Ministry of Food pamphlets urged families to use every scrap, and bread and butter pudding became the rare moment when children looked forward to seeing old bread in the larder. The scent of nutmeg and vanilla drifted from ovens on Saturday afternoons, promising comfort after a week of rationed meals. When the dish emerged, the top was golden and crisp, the inside soft and custardy, with currants swelling in every bite. Mothers spooned out generous helpings, often with a jug of hot custard to stretch the sweetness further. Diaries from the 1950s recall the quiet pride in serving a pudding that cost almost nothing but filled the table with warmth. In homes where waste was unthinkable, bread and butter pudding stood as proof that thrift could taste like gratitude. A dessert built on discipline, memory, and a little imagination. Number 3. Apple crumble became the emblem of sweet thrift in post-war Britain, a pudding born from necessity, yet cherished for its comfort. When rationing made fat and flour precious, housewives traded the rich pastry of apple pie for a simple topping of margarine, flour, and a handful of sugar, scattered over stewed, homegrown apples. By 1960, surveys recorded that 80% of households baked some form of fruit pudding each week, and apple crumble led the way, especially in autumn, when gardens and allotments overflowed with windfalls. The scent of bubbling apples, sharp and sweet, mingled with the brown sugar crust as it crisped in battered enamel dishes. Children hovered near the oven, waiting for the moment when the crumble emerged, steaming and golden, the promise of a hot pudding on a cold night. The ritual was never complete without a jug of custard, poured thick and slow, pooling in the corners and soaking into the crumbs. For many, the memory of apple crumble is inseparable from the sight of a kitchen table crowded with plates, each spoonful proof that austerity could still taste like abundance. It was a dessert that celebrated what was at hand, turning scarcity into something joyful. Though ready-made versions fill supermarket shelves today, the homemade crumble, served warm, with apples from the garden and custard from a tin, remains a symbol of cozy resilience, a sweet answer to the hardships that shaped a generation. Number 2. Jam roly-poly rolled across Britain's school canteens and kitchen tables as the undisputed champion of suet puddings. Thick swathes of dough, heavy with suet and flour, were spread with a generous slick of bright red jam, then rolled tight and steamed or baked until the kitchen windows fogged and the pudding swelled with sticky sweetness. In the 1950s, school dinner registers listed jam roly-poly as a weekly fixture, its arrival met with cheers or groans depending on who you asked. Slices landed steaming onto plates, dense enough to slow the hungriest child, and always swimming in a pool of thick, yellow custard ladled from battered jugs. Women's Institute recipe books from the era record endless variations, but the essentials never changed. Suet for heft, jam for cheer, and a shape that promised seconds if you could finish the first wedge. Oral histories recall the ritual. Children scraping plates, teachers warning against wasting pudding, and the unspoken contest to see who could manage a second helping without flagging. For many, the taste of jam roly-poly is inseparable from the memory of school halls, echoing with chatter and the clatter of spoons on enamel. It was a morale booster in kitchens still shaped by rationing, a dessert that turned the simplest ingredients into a celebration of abundance. Today, jam roly-poly is a rarity, its presence in modern homes all but vanished, but its legend endures, proof that even the heaviest pudding could lift spirits on the greyest British afternoon. And finally, in first place, spotted dick and treacle sponge crowned the Sunday table as the ultimate morale boosters of post-war Britain. These steamed suet puddings, heavy with dried fruit or flooded with golden syrup, stood as the sweet reward after a week of stretching shillings and ration books. Housewives kept tins of Lyle's golden syrup tucked at the back of the pantry, a staple so common that Ministry of Food advertisements in the 1950s called it the sunshine in a tin. The making of spotted dick began with suet and flour, rolled with sultanas or currants, then steamed for hours until the kitchen filled with the warm, nutty scent of pudding. Treacle sponge, its sibling, offered a sticky amber sweetness that clung to every spoon, promising comfort when winter shadows pressed against frosted windows. Children waited impatiently for the moment the pudding basin was turned out, steam rising as syrup pooled around the soft, yielding sponge. Mothers, armed with battered recipe books and a sense of ceremony, served thick slices with custard poured from chipped jugs, the yellow river soaking into every crumb. Oral histories recall the strict rule: If syrup touched your vegetables, you were sent out of the kitchen, no exceptions. In the leanest years, these puddings lifted spirits, marking the difference between mere survival and a sense of celebration. Diaries from the era speak of the anticipation. Spotted Dick for Sunday. Boys cheered, even father smiled. Today, their memory lingers mostly in cookbooks and nostalgia. But for those who tasted them, Spotted Dick and Treacle Sponge were more than desserts. They were proof that, even in the hardest times, sweetness could be conjured from thrift. The last spoonful was always a promise. Next week there would be pudding again, and hope would rise with the steam. Across all 15 entries, from the comforting beef stew that opened our list to the triumphant Spotted Dick and Treacle Sponge at the very top, these forgotten British foods tell a powerful story of survival, thrift, and ingenuity. Some dishes, like bread and dripping or tripe and onions, stand out as the most shocking reminders of post-war hardship, while others, such as apple crumble and jam roly-poly, reveal how sweetness and comfort could be coaxed from the simplest of ingredients. The common thread throughout is resourcefulness, stretching every shilling, wasting nothing, and turning scarcity into tradition. Suet, stale bread, and cheap cuts recur in nearly every entry, underscoring how necessity shaped the national palate. This ranking is not just about what disappeared from our kitchens, but what these dishes represent: the resilience of working-class families and the deep cultural memory woven into every steaming pot and pudding. In the end, these 15 lost foods are more than recipes. They are the taste of a generation that endured, adapted, and, against the odds, found moments of warmth around the table.